Hello and welcome to the programme bringing together leading UK commentators, BBC specialists and the correspondents who write, blog and broadcast for audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, will England pay a price for Boris Johnson's Freedom Day? And a trifecta of global worry: Afghanistan, Iran and Lebanon. The Dateline panel trying to put your mind at rest, or not. The Sudanese author and journalist Nesrine Malik, Bronwyn Maddox, Director of the Institute for Government, and before that, Foreign Editor at The Times. And with me in the studio, the Middle East Editor for the BBC World Service, Sebastian Usher. Welcome to you, Sebastian, and welcome to both of you. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, the sound of an English summer. No, not leather or willow, nor the clink of ice against glass, but the electronic ping of an alert on your mobile phone advising you to self-isolate because you've recently been in contact with someone who's developed COVID. In just 1 week this month, 600,000 people were notified by the Health Service app. What effect might Monday's ending of restrictions have on that pingdemic, one which has affected Boris Johnson, his Chancellor, the Secretary of State for Health, and don't forget the Leader of the Opposition. Bronwyn, this is, some people would say, quite a brave bit of policy making by the government, but presumably in the run-up to deciding to lift these restrictions, it will have factored in the evidence coming from scientists that there would indeed be a third wave in the summer.
You'd like to think so. I think this one is being driven by not just politics, but the sense that the Prime Minister really wants to get the economy open. But it is an unusual thing, brave is one way of putting it, to be opening up at just the point when cases are surging, albeit from a low level. And the world is looking to Britain with astonishment, but also to see what happens with this experiment, which is really an experiment about whether the vaccines can break the pattern of the past, whether enough people are vaccinated to mean that the surge doesn't really take off.
So in a sense, you could argue that England is, whether it intends to or not, is doing the world a huge favour by providing this kind of giant experiment on whether the system and people can withstand the Delta variant.
I guess that's right. I'm not sure it's an experiment the world is rushing to run on itself, but people are looking very closely. But you're referring at the beginning to the pingdemic, and this is where the government policy looks not just brave but contradictory, because on the one hand it's saying open up, on the other hand saying isolate yourself if you get pinged, and more people have been, because the virus is spreading quickly at the moment. And yet it's got this policy which is dangling, just coming as soon as August the 16th, where you'll be able to test yourself or get tested. And then if you're free of virus, keep going to work. And people are saying, well, if you're going to do that then, just 3 weeks away, why not now? And there isn't really a good answer, I think. And
that's where this point was raised, Sebastian, by Jeremy Hunt, the former Health Secretary. Said there's a danger of losing social consent if you the rules kind of appear to be contradictory. People will start losing faith in them or just ignoring them altogether, which presumably is a bigger risk.
It is. If you remember, if we go right back to the start of this, that was a major concern of the government back then when you had Cummings, Dominic Cummings in charge, was essentially part of that was an experiment almost in how to socially manage this. He said there's only a certain amount of time that people will continue to obey. I think it was about 2 months. So we're back to really testing that again. And I think we're testing it in England, in the UK, in a new way, that people have been through so much and they have done so many restrictions that they've essentially run out of restrictions that they still believe in. And I mean, obviously there is a question over how much signalling by the government has really given people confidence over this. I mean, one very brief thing, as somebody who's reporting a lot on what's going on in the rest of the world, a lot of those, not on the side who say that we should keep restrictions, but saying, look, we've got to end the restrictions. It's far worse having those restrictions and closing the economy. It's a far worse hit to everybody in all sorts of ways. Speak about it almost as if the UK is operating in a vacuum and that there aren't all these other countries around the world who are constantly removing restrictions and reimposing them. For example, Israel at the moment, which was the success story in a way, is now moving back with a much lower rate to reimposing a green pass on where people can go, to all sorts of restrictions, and talking of making those more stringent. In some of the Gulf countries, we just had the Hajj in Saudi Arabia. Still, the Hajj was down to 60,000 people. Incredible restrictions there. And those restrictions are not necessarily popular. I mean, a lot of people that I saw online were essentially saying this is anti-Islamic. These are people who are in control of Saudi Arabia who are trying to close down Hajj. So, these are issues that all governments are facing in different ways around the world.
Now, you mentioned Dominic Cummings, the former chief advisor, and we heard from him yet again, Nisreen, this week. I wondered if you were at all impressed by his critique of the way Boris Johnson governs.
Well, it was a rich critique for a start, because the way Boris Johnson governs, particularly with regard to how the pandemic was managed, was something that was very significantly determined by Dominic Cummings himself. So it does seem to be the sort of sour grapes of someone who's fallen out with Boris Johnson because he could no longer keep him in line. And what Dominic Cummings's sort of going rogue exposures and revelations have shown us is that the narrative, the sort of suspicions about the failures of the government from the start are correct. So in that sense, he didn't tell us anything new about Boris Johnson's incompetence, about the confusion around lockdown, around the sort of ideological resistance to locking down, even when it was becoming clear that hundreds of thousands of people would perish. It was just that it was now in the open and someone from within the government was making those statements. This kind of supports Bronwyn's point from earlier, which is that there is a sort of fatigue, not only with the restrictions, but with the sense that there isn't really a hugely sort of confidence-inspiring address from the government itself, and from people who have left the government. And, it's worth noting that on the day, or Freedom Day, quote unquote, as it is called in England, Boris Johnson himself was in isolation, and Sajid Javid, the Minister of Health's isolation, and the leader of the opposition then went into isolation as well, because they were also pinged. So it does seem to be that the narrative that is coming out from people leaking about how the government has managed this, and the way it is sort of technically and practically signaling about how to go about unlocking is really not inspiring a lot of confidence at all.
Bronwyn, I mean, our confidence might have been shaken even more in the way we're governed by the 3 reports this week into the Lex Greensill affair. This is about a businessman who seems to have had, as one inquiry put it, remarkable degree of influence inside government. Nobody seems entirely clear how he ended up being appointed, who was responsible for him, but he ended up employing a former Prime Minister who then got his reputation burnt by lobbying on his behalf. He didn't break any rules. There was a committee who said that may be because the rules were too weak and aren't as good as they should be and effective enough. Oh, have we become a bit complacent about our model of government in this country?
I think so, but I think it's interesting. We're in transition, I think, from the old model, which was all about rules and unspoken conventions, and relying really on a kind of club of people to keep those going, relying a lot on trust. And we're in transition to a place where people have broken those rules, but also people are more sceptical. The public is more sceptical that just because people say that they're following rules, that they are. And so I think we are in transition to something that is more transparent, more skeptical, more questioning, and needing more things written down. But what these reports showed is that is the really unpalatable side of that transition, where if a Prime Minister, past or present, wants to break the rules or break the spirit of the rules, he just can and just has. And it's really very hard to reach for sanctions for that because so little is actually codified about all this.
Nisreen, last thought on that. I mean, is it something that we need to be much more aware of in a global context? Because we're quite good at lecturing other parts of the world on standards of governance.
Yes, that's one of Britain's specialities. I agree that we're in a mode of transition, but I think it also shows what happens, and this happened in the United States as well. It shows what happens when the sort of conventions of government that were observed by a certain type of politicians these conventions are completely informal. When you get a government or a party that becomes a bit more extreme and sort of positions itself as a rule breaker, and the Tory party since Brexit has positioned itself as a party, most actually in the case of Dominic Cummings himself, he kind of dictated this line that the Tory party is going to shake up things in the UK, and that the government had become sort of corrupt in its elitism. And so interestingly, the Conservative Party is assailing these norms in terms of what David Cameron has done, and also internally at the moment in response to the pandemic, there's like huge scandals with regards to illegal or sort of irregular commissioning of Tory donors to help with pandemic responses and been given contracts to produce PPE, etc. They have framed this as sort of a nimble and efficient way of going about things, as opposed to a calcified, old school way of going about it. So there's sort of two contradicting narratives. And actually, I think, despite the intense media coverage of all these irregular contracts and David Cameron's behaviour, I think the Tory address about how they're changing the way that governance works in the UK to the benefit of the public is actually cutting through.
Thank you all very much. Now, the BBC used to make a TV programme a few years ago. It was called Snog, Marry, Avoid. It was supposed to make audiences think again about what constitutes beauty. Well, our foreign policy version considers whether foreign powers should intervene. So we've called it Engage, Disengage, Avoid. Let's begin in reverse order with Avoid. Sebastian, Lebanon, people will remember the big explosion back in the summer of last year, which devastated huge parts of the city of Lebanon. But it seems as if somebody has almost kind of detonated a bomb under both the financial and political systems of the country itself. And it's a country that was kind of so much shaped by the intervention, meddling, or however you want to put it, of other countries. Can you summarise what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, we're coming up to the anniversary. It's August the 4th that this happened, and the Lebanese are saying, nobody's been held responsible. A prime minister resigned after it. A prime minister was put in place. He, just a week or so ago, said he can't produce a government. That's after 9 months. This paralysis is extraordinary. And in some sense, the awfulness of the explosion, somehow it was almost like the whole system, I think, for many people in Lebanon, being symbolised in that massive, extraordinary, almost nuclear blast that destroyed parts of Beirut. And I think that's why it struck home so strongly with people who've lived through all and navigated through the very difficult kind of way that you chart your course in Lebanon. Because this is a crisis that goes back years and years. I mean, obviously there was the civil war. There was an attempt to patch things up out of that. There was the rebuilding of Beirut. There was an attempted restructuring of the way that the political elite and the way the country is managed. But it never changed anything. The same faces were still there. The same dynasties were still there. There were terrible things which happened, like the killing of Saad Hariri in 2005. But look at the man who just last week said that he couldn't make it as prime minister. That's Saad Hariri. Look at the man who's in power, the president, President Michel Aoun. He was there at the end of the civil war. He was fighting a rearguard action in the palace that he's now in. And it seems to be this inability of the Lebanese political class to make any real concessions to each other. And that's blocking the international community from giving the money that they promised to bring in after the blast. And just very briefly, you talk about go back. Let's talk just economically. For years and years and years, Lebanon survived because of the money that was coming in. It came in for all sorts of reasons, partly expatriates, partly every summer they had a bonanza with tourism, with people coming back and putting money into the economy, but mainly in the last few years through an incredible, almost Ponzi scheme to do with interest that you got on the dollar. So it brought dollars into the country, hard currency, but at a major cost, which is people were essentially holding dollar accounts that were paying levels of interest that are unbelievable. When credit got called in 2 years ago, when all of that closed down, that's when the protests began. That's when it all came to a stop.
Bronwyn, this was a country that, in a sense, the big powers created this strange political balance in the system. You had the regional powers meddling in it for years. Nobody seems to want to get involved now that it's falling apart. Are they right to avoid it?
I don't think they are avoiding it. I'm sorry to spoil your scheme there, but France is trying very hard for a start to try and bring the political parties together and the world as Sebastian was saying, is ready to try and help if the political class can actually try and form a government. I mean, to call it a Ponzi scheme is absolutely right. It's the elites running the financial system for themselves, propped up from all this money coming in. And then when things happened, like the big explosion that deterred Lebanese from sending their money back to Lebanon, the whole thing began to fall down. So it's an extraordinary case of implosion, not from war. There's plenty of war in Lebanon's background. But right now, it's just implosion from really terrible government. But I think other governments, more stable around the world, would be very willing to help if the political class of Lebanon can actually do the very basics, which is form a government.
A very big if, Nesreen.
And even though it's not related to war, the war still casts quite a long shadow. One of the reasons that the Lebanese political class is so stuck in its ways is that it's kind of still frozen in the configuration that they managed to strike in order to maintain the peace. And so every kind of religious group or sect is ghettoized, both in its political power and almost geographically and physically in Beirut and across Lebanon. And so there is also a sort of long tail of long civil wars that if they don't fundamentally change the power structure of the country, they can still in such a way an economic crisis does happen, you're still stuck in the sort of politics of conflict that have not really been resolved in such a way that the country can make a clean break with the past.
Bronwyn, let's talk about another country, the one that now we're seeing the world trying to disengage from. Might be easier said than done, and that's Afghanistan. Do you think the Taliban is serious about peace talks, or is this just a tactical interest in peace while it slowly strangles the cities by doing things like taking the border posts, by securing more and more control of large parts of the country?
I'd go for that one. I think it's very hard to have peace talks when one side is making such gains day by day, week by week, as the Taliban now is. That doesn't mean it's absolutely impossible to have a deal. They may well be less strong and less capable of holding on to cities if they capture any than their progress in the past few weeks would suggest. But they're on a roll at the moment, and that is a very, very hard time to do a deal. But the neighbours are serious. Iran, Uzbekistan, probably Pakistan, maybe with a bit of British encouragement, are serious about not wanting an implosion or civil war within Afghanistan, and are capable of bringing some pressure to bear on the Taliban to at least take part in talks. But it's going to be very hard to make that stick until they run out of steam a bit, I think. It's rational then, isn't it, Nesreen, for all whatever criticism there might be from Washington, from London, from other countries, for neighbours like Pakistan, like Turkmenistan, as you say, like Iran, to kind of make nice with the Taliban if they think they're going to be running the country in a few months' time?
Yes, I mean, the political calculus changes very quickly if they feel that there is going to be a surge and that the Taliban will be the main party of power. And so I'm not confident that the sort of placatory influence from neighbours to try and get the Taliban on the table and get peace talks to force a resolution is going to hold. The Taliban makes serious gains. It is in the interest of its neighbours not to start their sort of relationship in this new sort of post-US withdrawal in the middle of the night era as sort of conflicting protagonists. So no, I agree.
Let's talk about the third one in what I call the trifecta of woe at the start, Sebastian. That was disengage. Okay, engage is Iran, and it is clearly the world is engaging with Iran. What are the prospects looking like for talks, which I think are due to restart again just over a week's time, by which there'll be a new, regarded as being more hardline president in Tehran? Does that matter?
I don't think it matters so much, Ebrahim Raisi. I mean, essentially, the shots are called by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He's obviously hardline and people around him. In a sense, not having that dichotomy between a more moderate, I wouldn't say reformist president we've had for some time, Hassan Rouhani, who was the architect of to some extent from the Iranian side, of the 2015 nuclear deal. In a sense, it somehow makes it less complex. It makes it clearer. The line is there. So I think what matters is two people who aren't there anymore. President Trump in the US, I mean, his policy of maximum pressure backed up by his administration brought us essentially to where we are, brought the reflex action from Iran in terms of moving away as it has more and more from the deal. So without that, even with the Biden administration in a slight quandary still about where it goes, and in the Mexican standoff with the Iranians, that still is a defining feature. And in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu has gone now. He was a major voice, obviously, since forever. I looked at a video on YouTube from when he lived in America in the 1970s, and he was saying exactly the same thing about Iran then as he's been saying in the past few years. There hasn't been a change in the attitude in Israel to that, but it's less of a major defining issue for the political class there. So that takes some of the pressure off. Also, you're seeing the other major push against any kind of agreement, Saudi Arabia, which had huge influence during President Trump, is also beginning to change for a variety of reasons, but it's looking to find some way to live with Iran again rather than just in direct hostility. So that pressure has gone. But diplomatically, I think we've had 6 rounds so far in Vienna, going back to April. I had been reporting saying, everyone's thinking, the timetable is up until the election. That gives you the chance where Rouhani's still there. He went, that went. Then there was a talk, well, before Ibrahim Raisi takes power, that's the perfect moment for him to do it. That's gone because we've had various officials in Iran saying, we're not going to do anything till he comes in. It's the new administration's position. As far as we know, despite all the rhetoric that changes things all the time, despite all the pressures, it still looks like a deal essentially is there. It's been sort of pretty much agreed. But who is actually going to get it over the line and commit to it is still a big question. The one thing that could really change that is from the Iranian perspective of saying, look, under a new president, we are thinking that deal back in 2015 isn't the deal that we really want. We want to have more wriggle room about a whole variety of conditions. If that happens, then it could all dissipate and go. I would say at the moment the betting still is a deal will be done because it's in both sides' interests, US and Iran.
Good. That's Iran. There's a chance now for each of you to tell us about a story you think hasn't had as much attention as perhaps it should have had, or if it's had attention, we haven't been as across it as we should be, as people who are interested in what's happening around us in the world. Nesreen, first of all with you.
Well, I'd like to mention the Guardian's investigation to the Pegasus phone hacking / spying scandal. It has got a lot of attention, so it's hardly a sort of undercover topic. But I think it's absolutely staggering, like the number of people whose phones have been compromised, both in the media and in politics. The threat that this presents to media freedom and to political freedom across the world is one issue. But then the second issue is sort of the ubiquity of these espionage systems and software, and the sort of penetration that they have is, I don't think, something that we're quite aware of and that we've reckoned with. And the Pegasus investigation has mentioned 50,000 compromised devices, but that's just what we know at the moment. And having sort of looked into it further, there are so many loopholes, even in our own devices as individuals, that can be used for all sorts of reasons. And I think that this is sort of the next frontier in both personal privacy and also media freedom and political freedom as well.
Always check your settings. Bronwyn.
I think the next frontier in looking at whether corruption is taking hold in Britain is really in local government. And it's for one general reason that local government's been under enormous financial pressure. You've got a lot of money that comes up against it in planning, developers and so on. And you've had councils really wriggling to try to work out how to get more money because they're not getting it from central government. So they've been buying property, trying to buy property in high streets and so on. Some of that will have gone turned out to be a bit dodgy. And there isn't quite the scrutiny there used to be. There used to be something called the Audit Commission, and now councillors can, by and large, essentially pick their own auditors. And this isn't from some great wave of venality, if you like, but out of desperation. I think we'll see. I think we're going to see more scandals there. We've had one or two high-profile ones, like Liverpool, but
more to come.
But I think more to come.
Sebastian, you've got about 30 seconds.
This relates a little bit to what Nazreen was talking about, the spyware. In Morocco at the moment, 3 journalists this month have been sentenced to long time in jail, essentially for independent investigators. I remember when I was a correspondent back in Morocco more than a decade or so ago, one of the heartening things was the way that the media landscape there was developing. These voices were growing. I remember these people were at the spearhead of it. They're now in jail. That's a real issue. And they're using, not just accusing them of spying, but they're using, which makes it more difficult in a sense to defend them, fight for them, saying that they are guilty of sexual assault. They say that's trumped up.
Sebastian Usher, Nazreen Malik, Bronwyn Malik, thank you all very much. Just to be clear, I think it was Rafik Hariri who was assassinated, our former leader of Lebanon. Thanks for your company. Dateline London back same time next week.